here, and I welcome you to Convexplorations, a podcast that explores using a combination of conversation, meditation, hypnotic techniques, intellectual inquiries, sound, music, language, and curiosity to explore healing, spirituality, and imaginative reality tunneling for the 21st century and beyond. Everyone, welcome. I have with me a dear friend, Andreas Philippopoulos-Mihalopoulos, an amazing guy, wonderful colleague. I escaped academia, he hasn't. He's Professor of Law and Theory at Westminster, but he's spending a lot of time doing performance art. He's a fiction writer. He's an incredibly creative thinker, and he's an absolutely adorable human being. And it's lovely to have you here, Andreas. And Andreas and I are just going to basically play together. Convexploration style, conversational exploration, and see where it goes. Andreas, where would you like to go first?
I love that. You know what? I wanted to pick up on the interlapping. It's been with me for a while. Interlapping is, for context, is something that you used in your recent podcast. And you're trying to put together, I think, different practices. And of course, you can talk a bit more about what it is exactly and how you mean it. But the reason for which I love it is because it brings a very aquatic feel to it. Of course, I I love lapping waves, wavelets. I don't like huge waves. I'm fascinated by them. Everyone is fascinated by tsunamis, etc. But what I'm really interested in is this kind of slow overlapping, but as you say, interlapping, because these are not different matters. They're the same matter moving and creating layers and surfaces which come and interplay. And to me, the maybe because it's a very soft Monday and I'm feeling it, but that's how I feel the world today. I feel it very nicely, slowly lapping. And of course, there's crises and horrors, but there's also the possibility of just finding little pulsating moments of being where you you become one with the surrounding waves, the little interlapping materiality that
Yeah,
you co-create, of course, you co-generate.
yeah. I kind of think that we are a form of interlapping. I feel like we're a kind of complex generative material cascade of intelligences, some of which are millennia older than even the human form, speaking some of the earliest languages of the planet, dark and light and movement. Um, but I also love the idea of interlapping as a metaphor for perhaps somewhere where socially and politically we as a species need to move towards in an imaginary to move us away from hierarchies and centrisms, which as we look out across the world and we look at what's happening now and we look at the kind of as a kind of an inflection point that we're
Mm.
reaching with the neoliberal removal of the ceiling on inequality and the accumulation of unaccountable levels of wealth in some, and the concomitant predatory pressure that goes with that intrinsically. It's intrinsically anti-democratic characteristics. I think this idea of interlapping is very invitational in terms of thinking of how consciousness shifts come, how we as human collectives, as communities, might start to imagine a different way of co-creating worlds that we want to live in, worlds otherwise to the current one world, which is
Mm.
so destructive. And I'd love your thoughts on that, because I know that your work is also highly politically relevant.
Thank you. The way I've been trying to think through this is through I suppose what one could call some sort of elemental thinking, and I'm really in the past I've used air quite a lot. Now I've decided that I can finally succumb to my artistic practice passion, which has always been water, and move it into the academic. Well, at the same time, it's not really academic because I think part of my mission, I think Anna, your mission as well, when you were in academia, but I think still from without, there's a implicit or explicit mission to change academia as well, an academic discourse. And I think greatly what I'm trying to do is do that. So when people say, is this an academic text, or even worse, when people say, is this law, being in the law school, it's always, I mean, it's increasingly a source of frustration. But and I my patience is getting a bit limited now. But at the same time, that's also a good reaction in the sense that, yes, of course it is. And, just open your eyes and see what it is and see the necessity of accepting it. So then in this book, the Hydrojustice book, I have tried to bring in what I've called wave writing. So it's a way of writing which also often is dictated by the text itself, rather than by the whatever it is, a superior rationality that dictates and directs the text. So very much in the way of it's and indeed it's not a metaphor, it's the way that one lets oneself be carried by the waves of the text and how the various concepts and perhaps it's not a stream of conscience, but it's the way that the need to say something is coming and taking over. So that's the first act of politics, in the sense of, for me, to find ways of coming to touch with a need, and then the need to express, and perhaps find a way to express it that that is it's loyal to the subject and to the substance of what it is that I'm trying to say. So in that very broad sense, I think it's really very important to keep a practice that is faithful to the matter and that we cannot separate the two. So the politics of hydrojustice are politics of horizontality. That means is essentially what you said earlier about non-centrism and non-hierarchies. And I try to talk about how rather verticality has been maybe the sort of it's been a few centuries now, which has been the main human impetus, to go higher, to stand upright, or to go deeper. But whatever it is, like either this or that. And what I'm thinking of is how precisely those surface movements, the horizontal movement of the water, the surface movement of the ice, the way that the fog sort of caresses the various surfaces. These are the ways in which I'd like to think of organization, of being next to one another. So I've been talking for a long time about this need for confluence through and against each other, but in different elements. So the previous one was about air, now it's so much about the complexity of water, and then the complexity of the water cycle, and how water has so many forms, and it's not just liquid. I'm very aware of it. I still am interested in the liquid, because there is where you can see those things much more readily, and the precisely that thing of, and we'll use the word again, interlapping, where there is a sort of a movement to cover the upper surface, but at the same time without relinquishing the fact that there is a commonality of matter, whatever the surface or wherever this thing is moving towards. And so that's the second, perhaps, moment of politics and hydrojustice. It's to practice the both this connection between the matter and the practice, that is horizontally, without distinguishing between practice and matter, and without trying to build a hierarchy of concepts or a hierarchy of meaning, And that's particularly difficult because, of course, we are constantly required to create a hierarchy of meaning that is, bullet one, bullet point two, da 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 da. This is so much easier. It's the kind of stuff that people like to read, and I'd like to read it sometimes too, but that was not the purpose of the book. And so then I think the other thing that I tried to do is think of my connection to water ethnographically. And that I think is perhaps the most interesting part of writing. So to be able to write about oneself without necessarily talking about oneself. Yes, sometimes no. But being aware of the fact that whatever you do, you just you write about yourself. And and the self is the thing that contains everything else as well as being contained by everything else. So the self is dilutable, is gone. And that's the practice of it. So to allow the text to come and flood flood the self and still come up with some sort of bubble of of I wouldn't say coherence, but perhaps of bubble of roundness.
Of what?
Roundness.
Yeah.
I like
There's so
yeah.
much that comes up as I listen to you there. I mean, I think that, this point about materiality and the point about the kind of more than conscious openness to the significance of materiality itself in the writing is really stunning, because I think particularly as Westerners, we tend to privilege a very narrow cognitive frame, and it goes with the with the hierarchical and the sense of orderingness.
Mm.
The minute we put something in a line and say 1, 2, 3 and prioritize,
Yeah.
we're creating a kind of a tunnel, right? Whereas your horizontality, when you combine it with the liquidity of the materiality, you're talking about water, can kind of go anywhere. It's
Mm.
rhizomatic in the sense
Mm.
that it moves laterally, but it's not only on the surface because it seeps below. Water has a way of finding channels in the most unexpected places. And as a kind of political metaphor, I find it really intriguing because I remember years ago reading Upendra Baxi, who claimed that there was no outside to neoliberalism, that, we were kind of, if you found an interstices, you were kind of, that was great, but there was no outside. But when you start thinking politically with water, water is kind of undefeatable in some amazing sense, because even when you contain it, you can't guarantee that it's going to remain contained over time. There's something extraordinarily resilient about water, even in its most gentle formation, its most gentle expression. It is always somehow has this intrinsic possibility of exceeding the boundaries of the assumed. And I love that because it really ties in with the idea of the hypnotic. So stay with me here. But sometimes when you work with a client, what you're really interested in is not giving them any new particular thing. What you're really interested in is destabilizing a present certainty that is counterproductive for them, that they experience themselves as a form of auto-limitation, whether or not they're aware of it. And I feel that politically we're in the same kind of position where we've got a collective set of auto-limitations, things that we take as given, kind of reality tunnels that we're inhabiting together, that operate a kind of closure. But thinking rhizomatically and thinking even more fluidly than a rhizome with water, which isn't even constrained to a kind of root,
Mm.
but can expand beyond even lateral root relationships, I think is a lovely idea of a kind of flooding, a kind of swarming, a kind of overwhelming of the closures that is intrinsically invitational to an otherwise without dictating what that otherwise
Yeah.
would be. And that's where the co-negotiation, the interlapping that you mentioned, the multiplicity of surfaces, the foldings,
Mm.
the engagement, and necessity of, maybe Donna Haraway would say, of staying with the trouble, of
Mhm.
staying together in these moments where we're challenging the closure and the certainty that keeps us so limited. So that was just stuff that was just coming to me
Yeah,
listening to you.
beautiful. And as you say, I mean, water is precisely, I mean, it's the embodiment of what of the way that Deleuze and Guattari have interpreted Spinoza's affect, that is the thing that exceeds the body of its emergence. And it's so beautiful to think of something that, yes, it has a body and it has a thing in which it emerges, but then in its own practice, emergence is rather the excess is included. And as you say, you can never contain water, and the water will find a way out, and etc. And all will, will evaporate, or will solidify, or whatever. So it's will seep, and it's just this is stunning because at the same time it really defies pretty much the quite a lot of the way that the Western, especially logic, has been operating. And of course, in order to study and understand water, we've always placed it in tubes and boxes and things in lab conditions. But that misses out on the mad creativity of water and how it keeps on, becoming like it never is. It's always this mad becoming. And I think that probably applies to all elements. But the reason for which I'm particularly interested in water as well is because there's I'm not being nostalgic about you know, this uh, this idea of water is where we came from, not in a geological sense, perhaps, but I would like to place it in precisely a planetary context. And it's very interesting how in English we have settled on the name Earth, but we all know that there's much more water than Earth, etc., etc. We also have discovered that right in the core of the planet there is water, and in some form. And I I go with there's a Greek word which I think is exceedingly beautiful, and it's called hydrogeus, and it's hydra and gear, the earth at the same time. So it's almost like
Mm.
there's an earth, but it's hydra, and it's almost like it's a flooded earth. It's the big blue, etc. And in that sense, there's a nostalgia. When currently as we speak, I think Artemis, this is it Artemis 2, I think is the spaceship that
Mm.
is sent by NASA. And they've been sending photographs, and there is this classic moment of seeing the big blue sphere from from a distance. And they say it's so beautiful. And there is this thing about, again, beauty in the aesthetics, but apart from that, it is that is water that is held in space by itself, and nothing spilled. It's so fantastic. It's just so extremely beautiful. And in that sense, there comes a nostalgia of the womb, and the need to go back to a certain liquid safety where you could breathe within the water and with the amniotic fluid, and how this connects perhaps to a futurity, a way that we can imagine humanity as very different to how we understand it now. So I'm really interested also in the speculative exploration of different forms of humanity. So you mentioned hypnotism, and I think it's just a wonderful way of sort of, listening and vibing with the waves that exceed you. And if one manages to do that, then I think, one should be very happy.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, I think we are so ourselves tidal. And I think this gets forgotten. I think in the West, and I work a lot, as you know, with people with complex chronic fatigues. And in that whole world, there's a discourse of recovery, which
Mm,
again has like
mm,
political, metaphorical, broader implications for how we think about what we do collectively now as we face this planetary moment where our linearities and our hierarchies and our artifices of control have actually brought us to a point where we are looking at ecological crises of multiple interconnected kinds, because of course it's all one entangled planetary whole. But that linearity of expectation that people can have when they're thinking about chronic illness, and the necessity to understand that we pulse as beings, that we are tidal, that there is no linearity, there is no linear return. We're always multiple becomings, multiple floods and flows and trickles and seeps at different levels of unimaginable complexity and intelligence, like trillions and trillions of mitochondria, that are, I think Jane Bennett talks about the it in the I, the kind of more than humanness of the human.
Yeah.
And when you start to talk about reimagining the human, like different modes of doing humanity, I think the more than human, the kind of humility to recognize the more than human nature of the human, the quintessential earthlingness of us as critters, and our wateriness as critters. I mean, we're an extraordinary amount of, water, actually, of different kinds, different fluids of different kinds. There's such an invitation here to expand our imaginary of what it actually even means to be a human being, and what it actually even means to be human communities. And I'd love your thoughts on hydrojustice in relation to water shortage, which we know is, people have been predicting that water wars are going to be the key wars of the fairly imminent future, and we're already looking down that reality tunnel. So I'd love your thoughts on hydrojustice as it speaks to that particular tension that we're facing at the planetary level.
Yeah, I love thinking about water shortage on the same horizontality as excessive flooding and uncontrolled water disasters, because I think both of these things work on a very anthropocentric, of course, basis. So water shortage doesn't mean that there is no water, it means that there's no specific kind of water. And flooding doesn't mean that, it just means that, as you said earlier, water finds its way, and that's all it does. So yes, of course, cities are in the way, but it's because of the way that everything else surrounding those cities and the cities themselves have been built.
Mm.
So I think it's really important to see it as two, not even extremes, as two parts of a spectrum, and and understand that we are all complicit in what is happening, and we are trying to, the various ways and various technologies that are trying to, or technological propositions that are trying um to suggest ways out, and I think that's very much part of the problem. I mean, one, we embrace technology, and we know that we cannot live without it, but we also know that who knows how much, well, I don't know how much water we're actually spending now while we're talking. We're going to be talking for
Yes.
about, the whole half an hour, and God knows how many hundreds of liters of water will be washed through. So I think that's our complicity to both these conditions, to the spectrum of the conditions, is huge. I'm not saying that everyone is equally responsible, but I'll say that currently it's very difficult to understand the divisions of a humanity that's already so entrenched
Mm.
in such self-detrimental practices. And I think what we also have now is, as opposed to, say, I don't know, Middle Ages or Renaissance, where there was, just before Renaissance, let's say, where there was no need to think of horizontality. things were vertical, theological, regal, blah, blah, blah. But now we can't, we don't want to do that. We cannot comprehend, well, in at least in some rationalities, we cannot comprehend how these things can still be plausible. And therefore, we have situations which might be, objectively, maybe better than what was happening in 1500s in terms of accumulation of wealth or what have you. But instead, what we have now is a very, very strong political conscience that does not allow. We have tasted horizontality of some sort, and we don't want to let this go. We cannot accept it. And I think that's the way to do it. That's the way to go. And then that's the way to carry on with this kind of form of resistance. But then resistance takes so many different forms, and I still don't think that we can think of, this solitary hero or something like that. We need to think of waves of action that are happening, and we just ride that wave, and we are part of the wave, and we become the wave, and things change.
Mm.
But there's also temporality with it, just like floods, just like water shortages. There's a temporality, and that's something we cannot do much about. There's a thing that if we do give ourselves to the practice of waves, and that change only comes through waves, then we cannot even force that change. We have to wait until that horrible, and that's perhaps the thing that I say to myself, that I draw some sort of hope precisely from this sense that things go into cycles, and then because of social media, because of the way that life has sped up, hopefully this horrible cycle, politically and in terms of uh, world violence, will go a bit faster, and then we'll go to another arch
Mm.
of the cycle. Hydrojustice isn't the way that I've imagined it, isn't trying to give answers.
Yeah, sure.
It's opening up a space where questions are being questions are being asked. And what it tries to do at the same time is give hope, but not in a very traditional sense, because what I'm trying to think of in terms of hydrojustice is the way that um, justice and hydrojustice in particular, although I don't differentiate between the two, justice and hydrojustice anymore, has always been here and is always here. So in a sense, there's nothing we can do to achieve hydrojustice. The planet lives in a state of hydrojustice. So we have obscured it. We have placed things on top of it. We've buried it under the debris of accumulation and capitalism and neoliberalism, extractivism and colonialism. But hydrojustice hasn't gone away, and it's there. So when I spoke about the womb in relation to the planet, these are the temporalities that we're talking about. And this temporality in here is hydrojustice. Hydrojustice is there. So of course there are moments of intense hydro injustice. We're surrounded by it everywhere. Like the fact that we can switch on our tap and water comes out is is an instance of hydro injustice, considering the people in Central Africa that have to walk for 15 kilometers a day in order to get some water, and that water is probably not potable. So so the scales are very anguishing, but at the same time calming if we remove ourselves from the preciousness of what the human, the way we understand it now is. So I'm in a, and this comes from my speculative fiction, where I'm imagining a world where the human is changing and is becoming closer to what I've called hydrohuman, and whatever that is. And there's so many ways of one can imagining that. But I think on a molecular level, there might be a change that will respond or will precipitate the big planetary changes that we will be witnessing and we are witnessing. Coming to some sort of flow with the planetary hydrojustice moment that hasn't left even for a second.
Mm. So would you argue then, Andreas, or is your sense that verticality is no longer sustainable? That verticality itself has gone too far, that it's too, I mean, the verticality of, for example, the billionaire, trillionaire now class, one trillionaire, but, a significant one, one with a very verticality driven agenda, shall we say. That's hugely problematic. But verticality generally, maybe, in the sense that we've always, as communities, thought in terms of specific leaders, people who inspire, right? People around whom we cluster.
Yeah.
And there's a sense in which that can be transformative. But my sense for a long time has been that we need to move to a more distributed intelligence, to a much, much more collective, not even necessarily communitarian, but collective, distributed way of addressing challenges that we face, because that allows for multiple kinds of horizontal dynamics, non-centralized, but potentially with enormous capacity to communicate with each other from within a shared framework of epistemic equality, say, if we could imagine such a thing, and the capacity to unfold iteratively place sensitive, located, particular, sometimes unique responses to challenges that may be refracted in terms of, yes, there are commonalities, but there are also distinctions. And here I think, again, there's an interesting analog to water. Because I think is it Jamie Linton who talks about the problem with the idea of a global water supply, like in kind of like institutional World Health Organization or other global level organizations, there's this notion of a global water supply, which flattens out all the mad excesses and localized expressivenesses of waters of many kinds in many different situations. As you said, there are topologies, there are geographies, there are relations, there are, there'll be atmospheric dimensions in any given topology that are unique to that particular interaction between land, mass, air, and water. And I kind of feel that there's a metaphor there for how we might aspire to stay with the trouble we're in, and how we might aspire as humans who are happy to ask different questions without necessarily finding emphatic answers, to explore a way forward together to generate multiple kinds of responses that are exquisitely apt for the situation in which they emerge. I think we just need a much more horizontal politics, really, from what you're saying. I mean, if I'm understanding you correctly, and I'm hearing a really important critique of verticality and where it's led us in what you're saying. Would you agree? Have I misheard you?
I know you haven't. Thank you. Thank you for hearing very attentively. I think I think the moment where we hail as the beginning of humanity and Homo sapiens is also a way of, I'm not saying anything wise or new, but it's a moment of alienation. And while I'm not advocating a return, I'm trying to push forth an awareness of that distance between between something that we used to be and something that we are now, and how this has been driven to um, quite kitsch excesses, such as, massive skyscrapers or fracking. These somehow these these things um, are very related to me because they explore the arrogance of I mean, okay, and then we can think of it very, very figuratively as, of the phallic erection. And it's the erection of the building. And and if one wanted to use biblical metaphors, of course, one can go very easily to the Tower of Babel and think of it as precisely that moment of where, okay, there's a limit to your verticality. Do it, play with it, but don't take it too seriously. Like, understand that it's not that you belong somewhere. It's not about belonging. It's that it's not even a crisis of verticality in the sense that we haven't reached that moment where we kind of say, okay, it's difficult to go more vertical. It can carry on being vertical, but the point is this, that the more we do that, the more we pushed out of this planet's edge. We we're tilting, we're off balance, and that's a fact. I mean, it's nothing to it's not even a it's not a it's not an ethical suggestion. It's a very factual moment of, yeah, we are in very deep trouble, and there's nowhere else to go but to stay with this trouble. And I'm not. I live in some sort of a schizo moment where, in my mind, where I'm both optimistic and very pessimistic at the same time. And I think, yes, thank you for nodding, because I think a lot of us share precisely this. And it's not that I find optimism in the small, some might have called romantic gestures um, of return or of origin, but it's more about I I find solace in the grandeur of precisely this cycle, and that's why when in the final part of the book I propose a hydra contract, and that is a speculative contractual text written in quite, I think, quite strict legalese, uh, but it brings in bodies of water together with one another and works through some of the movements of how we can expect to flow with and against each other. Because, as you said, it's not just about coming together in unison as waters, but there's difference in water. There's a term by, well, several philosophers. I'm using Deleuze's way of thinking about the clinamen, which is, and also very interestingly, it's sort of the same root as clines in ocean waters, where they come together and they flow together, but they remain different. And I adore this soft, smooth sliding of difference. And I think we need to preserve that. And in the contract, what I'm trying to do is accept. Um, I've also called it the polyamorous ethics of shared flow. And that is that you receive and you give love in the sense of positioning yourself responsibly in relation to someone else, to everyone else. And you respect distances and propinquities. You respect the need for hidden alcoves, as well as the desire for open breathing spaces. And that's all through this contract unto hydrojustice. And what um, I'm having quite a lot of fun with is that one of the performances that I've devised around the book Hydrojustice is something that has to do with also my visual art production, which works with folds and flows, but actually an actual material concertina, sort of blocks of paper. But at the same time, I'm using this as part of an expression of the contract, which is a chanting expression of the contract where I go through the motions and the articles and there is a point that I give everyone a long piece of string that starts from a box filled with water. And then it's very important for me that the string does the whole round and brings in almost everyone, if possible, absolutely, not every, almost, absolutely everyone in the room. And the string is still a little wet, and so everyone has to hold it. And pretty much I'm hoping that they're holding for the rest of the performance.
Mm.
It creates a very interesting space. It creates almost like a in Jewish Orthodox tradition. There's practice of the eruv, the the string that they place around an area in the Shabbat during the Shabbat, so they can freely move and do some semblance of natural life, of sort of everyday regular life. And in a sense, that creates a bit of a sense of safety, but also a sense of pulsing community around me. And I love that moment where there is a little bit of a wave created on the basis as something as simple as a bit of wet string.
That's wonderful. I know that you said you had to go at this particular point in time, so we'll have to end it here. But I feel like we've got so much more to explore here, Andreas. Um, have you got, by any chance, a link to a film of that performance that I could make available for people listening to the podcast or watching this on YouTube?
I think there's some filming that has been done, and so I can send it to you,
That
yes.
would be amazing.
Yeah,
I think people might appreciate that. And thank you so much for giving up your time this afternoon.
I
And
will
you
do.
are there in the city of water.
I am in Venice.
So
Yes,
enjoy Venice, Andreas. And I very much look to continuing this conversation with you at some future point soon.
I would love to. Thank you, Anna.
All right, take good care.